I'm very pleased that there is so many different people from different disciplines of the sport attending this, because I think the subject tonight is relevant to a lot of you, whether it's canoe polo or whether it's recreational or whether it's pathways for going into sprint or marathon. So I think it's applicable to everyone. Just a few little housekeeping. If there is a question, I actually cannot see you. So, Margie, I'll leave it up to you to flag that with me, or at the end of the presentation, we can go through the questions then.
Can I just
Is
butt
that
in there
probably
for a
the best way?
second? Thank you, Anna, for reminding me. Guys, I've opened up the chat. Ask your questions on chat, because it looks like we're going to have quite a few people, and I will collate them, and where appropriate, we'll ask Anna, or we'll just wait till the end. Thank you, Anna. Back to you.
Thank you. Well, we'll get started. And what I want to talk about tonight is teenage physical development in relation to strength and conditioning and on-water training in kayaking, whether that's in a polo boat or in a plastic downriver boat or in a sprint boat, it really doesn't matter. And that is from a musculoskeletal and sports physiotherapy perspective. So what we'll go through first is some growth in teenagers. We'll have a look at their sexual development, skeletal development, muscular growth and development, their neuromuscular control, which is very important. And it actually relates to the picture on your right, where although that's an older person spilling their coffee, we see a lot of teenagers being very uncoordinated and doing exactly the same. Then we go on to joint stability. We look at what is passive stability, what is active stability, and what do we need to be aware of. We're looking at training adaptation. And then we're looking at consequences for development in the teenagers, in males as well as in females, and as it is a little bit different for both. Then we go to conclusion, and then you can ask all the questions you would like. So I'll have a look at sexual development first, and it's important to note the difference there between puberty, which is the physical change from a child to adult, and adolescence, which is the mental transformation from child to adult. So obviously we realize, you're right. So you guys still hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So just going back to that sexual development, puberty is the physical change from child to adult, and adolescence is the mental transformation from child to adult. So obviously there are some overlaps, but puberty is purely defined as the physical change, so the growth, and it finishes when the young adult has finished growing, really. Whereas we know that the mental transition from child to adult can, take 10 years or 20 years or sometimes 30 or 40 years. So there's quite a big difference there. So if we look at that, in boys, that development starts at about age 12 to 13 and finishes about 16 to 18 years old. So with 12-year-old boys, often the girls are a bit taller than them, or they're at the same height, but come 16 to 17 years old, we see that boys have grown consistently more than the girls. That's mostly due to an androgen called testosterone, which obviously causes most of those growth changes. So a male growth spurt begins a little bit later than a female. It accelerates more slowly and lasts for longer before the epiphysis of the bones fuse. So boys can still grow sometimes till about 20, 21 years of age, whereas most girls finish growing by about 17, 18 years of age. We see sexual maturation, voice changes, body hair, and acne. They develop heavier, longer bones and nearly twice the amount of muscle mass compared to females. And for those in high performance sport, that's quite important to note that boys develop that more muscle mass compared to females, but also developed more strength through that than females. So with the boys, we see an increase in shoulder width and jaw, and an increase in muscle mass, especially in the later stages of puberty. The early stages of puberty seem to be mainly as in growth in length, whereas their muscle mass comes into the later stages of puberty. Girls start a little bit younger, at about 10 to 11 years of age, and they finish growing at about 15 to 17 years old. Growth there is due to an estrogen called estradiol and is responsible for female development. Estradiol, it drives the physical growth spurt and the epiphyseal maturation and closure of the growth plates of the bones, causes sexual maturation and acne. The pelvis and the hips widen, and fat tissue in females increases to a greater percentage of the body mass than in males. And that's often an issue. So I don't even know why that slide is in there, so we won't go through that one. But in females, it's important to remember, and we get to that a little bit later as well, that yes, we grow slightly different, like we develop more adipose tissue than muscle tissue. So our strength gains in puberty are not similar, not the same strength gains as the boys get. So going through that muscular growth and development, so more in males due to the increased levels of testosterone. That starts after the onset of skeletal development. So initially what happens, the bones start to grow. So if you can imagine bones starting to grow, that means the muscles need to get stretched, and they lose a little bit of relative strength, or they tighten because they're trying to keep up with the bone growth. This can cause, for example, in boys, but also in girls, but more in boys, tight hip flexors. So that leads to an anterior pelvic tilt. They can get tight hamstrings. So that means it makes it very hard for them to sit up, for example, in a K1. And you see those teenage boys and they're paddling, and the coach is calling out, "Come on, sit up, sit up." But the athlete actually can't because their hamstrings will not allow them to sit up. We also see some slumped posture, especially in people that grow very quickly, and that can lead to tight pectoralis, which is your chest muscle, and a weak extensor mechanism. So they find it really hard to stand up straight if they slump for too long. And this can lead to an increased thoracic curve and a decreased rotation. And rotation is obviously very important especially in sprint kayaking. We also often see poor scapular control, so shoulder blade control, and that leads to winging of the shoulder blade and poor control of the shoulder joint. We can also see some pelvic instability and poor control, and that leads to poor force transfer through the stroke. So this is particularly important again in sprint, but I can imagine it is quite important in polo as well, where you have to be quite agile and very quick reactions. If we have a look at neuromuscular development and control, so development of the neural pathways always happens last during puberty. That's the end of the growth spurt. And that's why we see so many young athletes going through puberty. They're tall, gangly, uncoordinated, clumsy, they drop things, and they're unable to produce some voluntary contractions of some muscle groups. I actually did a study on this when I did my master's degree, and I live ultrasounded some of the teenage paddlers, and I asked them to contract part of their stomach muscles. And most of the teenage boys could actually not contract these voluntary. And that's because they were growing so fast, and they really just, their bodies just cannot keep up with controlling those muscles. So neuromuscular control comes last. And I remember some of the teenage boys in the gym, and my own son was one of them. You know, they had to do a squat or a deadlift. And we called my son, he was called Bambi, because he really just simply couldn't coordinate a simple squat until his neuromuscular control developed, and he was able to do that. Some factors, neural factors that are affected by resistance training. So when we do resistance training, the gains in the first 2 to 6 weeks are mainly due to an increase in that neuromuscular development and development of that pathway of sending signals to your muscles. So as you do movements, your neural control becomes better and better with those movements, which is an increased neural drive, and that's a recruitment rate and firing to the muscle. So basically, it's a fine tuning of the neural drive to your muscles. We also see an increased synchronization of motor units. Motor units are part of your muscle, and they actually work together better when you do resistance training. We see an activation of agonists, a deactivation of antagonists, an increase in coordination of all motor units and muscles involved in the movement. So as we move, our body learns to recognize patterns, and they become more automatic as we do them more. We also see an increase in voluntary activation of the muscle. So that means muscle can remember what it does, and it activates easier and quicker. So for sport, these adaptations will only be functional if we are able to contract the muscle properly within its kinetic chain. That means if we just do plain bicep curl, you know, a bicep curl in, for example, a cable machine, a cable row, or a cable pull, the biceps learns to work in a kinetic pattern that is more applicable to sport than just working as a plain biceps contraction. I hope that makes sense. If we go to motor learning, that's important in the gym, important in sport. That's the acquisition of new spatiotemporal muscle activation patterns. So basically, it's teaching your brain to move your muscles in a certain way. There are 3 stages of motor learning. One is the cognitive stage. So someone practices components of a task, for example, in paddling, activation of your transverse abdominis, which is one of your tummy muscles. So as you put your paddle in, for example, you ask the athlete to put the paddle in. As the paddle hits the water, you feel a contraction of the front of your shoulder, your chest, but also, if you do it properly, of your abdominal muscles. So making an athlete aware of that means they can learn to recognize that and learn to activate these muscles in the appropriate manner. And that's why it's important to give detailed instructions. So for example, in your catch, you should feel tension at the front of your shoulder in your chest and in your lower abdomen. So this requires quite high levels of cognitive attention, and that's obviously very difficult with teenagers sometimes, because their cognitive attention is usually not the best. And as a coach, it's important to keep reinforcing the messages, but at the same time, of course, keep it fun. And yeah, that can be a bit of a challenge. So with high performance athletes, once people into a national team, we can also use mental imagery, like where you pretend you putting your blade in the water, put a load on the blade and see which muscles you would activate. Someone who is learning this stage of patterning will need a lot of feedback on that performance. So as a coach, this is probably the time when an athlete needs you most, is when learning a new skill. Because if you learn this skill well, it'll stay with you for life. But if a mistake develops in this sort of skill and technically they keep struggling with it, as they try to go faster, it probably reinforces a poor movement pattern. So I always say the best coaches need to be in the pathways, because that's really important to get these first stages of motor learning done correctly. So your next stage of motor learning is the associative stage of motor learning. This is where we integrate the learned skills from the cognitive stage with simple to complex tasks. So here, the athlete is a little bit more capable of remembering how to, for example, paddle technically well. So in that case, you can reduce your instructions, reduce a little bit of feedback on performance, and reduce the need for attention to task. But you can slowly now increase the complexity of the task. For example, in flat water paddling, an athlete can be very adept at paddling at 60 stroke rate. And so they can really load the blade up, connect well at 60 stroke rate. So then you can ask an athlete to do that at 80 stroke rate. I imagine in a canoe polo situation, an athlete knows a basic skill, like turning a boat around quickly. To make this more difficult, you can ask the athlete to turn the boat further around or use a different technique to do this as well. So the last stage of motor learning is the automatic stage. And this only sort of occurs after extensive practice and habituation. So basically your movement pattern here becomes habit. And as you can imagine, if we didn't follow those first two stages properly, the poor movement patterns that we can develop there become habit as well. And habits are much harder to break once they're automated. So really important to pay attention to that cognitive and associative stage of motor learning. So in the automatic stage, we see an integration of developed skills into a motor pattern or kinetic chain. We can increase the complexity of the task. So for example, starts, loading, team loads become important. We can change environmental factors because they won't matter as much because the task is now automated. So these athletes should be able to paddle in wind, current, wash, and it shouldn't really affect their outcomes as such. All right, another thing we'll look at is joint stability, because in teenage development, this is very important as well. If we look at what compromises a joint, it's where two or more bones make contact. The joint allows movement, it provides mechanical support for the movement system, and it allows for force transfer. So the fact that it allows for force transfer is, of course, very important in any movement and any task, not just in sport. We have a look at joint stability, and we have a passive joint stability and we have active joint stability. Passive stability of a joint is provided by non-contractive restraints. So these are ligaments, bands, the capsule, menisci, cartilages, the different morphology, like the shapes of the bones, and often a labrum, like in the hip and the shoulder joint. These structures are all non-contractile, which means we cannot contract them to provide more stability around the joint. These are genetically determined, and there are differences in the collagen building blocks, which means, we go to the next slide. No, actually, we'll go back. So the genetically determined difference in collagen building blocks. Some people are naturally really tight collagen, which means their joints are not very flexible, whereas others are quite what we can call it sloppy collagen, which if you imagine an elastic band, sloppy collagen you can pull out a lot, whereas tight collagen you can't really stretch it out that far. And that's a bit similar with the bands and capsules around the joint. So simple tests you can do with your athletes to check whether they're hypermobile, which means there is a lot of joint movement, which means the collagen is likely of the sloppier kind, the softer kind. So if you get an athlete to extend their arms and they can extend their elbows, hyperextending meaning further than 180 degrees extension, that probably means they're quite mobile. So if your athletes can bend their fingers back like the fingers in my picture, it's probably a good idea to send them to a sports physiotherapist to design a stability program, because it means their joints are quite lax and they need to stabilize. Because as we put forces on them through the paddle or onto the water, there is more chance of damage with those sort of joints. Then let's talk about active restraints around the joint, and these are provided by muscle active restraints. I will divide the muscles into two types here. There's a lot of different ways to divide muscle, but for convenience now, I'll use the force or torque producing muscles and the smaller stabilizing muscles. So the large muscles, they're usually close to the body surface, and they usually run over two joints. As a rule, these are made for movement and they do not provide stability over a joint. To provide stability over a joint, we have smaller muscles. They run closer to the joint and they generally just run over one joint, except for in the spine. These muscles have to always have some form of contraction because they need to stabilize that joint at all times, and especially during force transfer. So if you're doing a start or a quick action in a canoe polar boat, it's really important to have the joint, and usually in paddling it's the shoulder, that is the first joint that really needs to stabilize to allow for adequate force production. So that was a previous slide where I was speaking about force or torque producing muscles and smaller stabilizing muscles. So with taking all that into account, your passive restraints and your active restraints, it means joints can be hypomobile, which does not allow for a lot of movement within the joint, which means the capsule around the joint, the ligaments and the passive restraints are quite tight, so not allowing for a lot of movements. So these joints are generally quite suitable in sports where we need to transfer a lot of force through a joint. The opposite of that is a joint can be hypermobile, which allows for more movement than normal due to the sloppy and the lax ligament and other restraints. So for example, in a sport like gymnastics or dance, you really like to see those athletes that are hypermobile, where the joint allows a huge range of movement. The problem with those is then that they need to provide really good active stability around their joint, not so they don't get injured. And then, of course, we have the normal range of mobility, which is not hyper, not hypo, but sort of in the middle. So Hypermobility can be an issue in paddling if we see people with that, because the forces potentially don't transmit through the joint properly. So this athlete depends on the active restraints around the joint for stability and force transfer. If there is poor force transfer through the joint, there is an increased risk of injury, for example, in the shoulder. So you can get labrum damage in the shoulder, you can get rotator cuff pathology, or you get the shoulder impingement. Just for examples. Adaptation. Let's talk about that for a bit. So overload training leads to adaptation. And it's important to note that adaptation means your training also needs to be varied. Like if you do the same training session week in, week out, your body is so used to that you do not get a training effect because the body just gets used to it and doesn't adapt any further at some point. So important to vary sessions or to give a person a different stimulus. So with adaptation, it's important to take a few things into account. So physiological training overload needs to be suitable for age, gender, training age, and physical limitations. And then it can lead to training adaptation. So for example, going back to someone with a hypermobile joint, obviously if we change this person's paddle length by 2 centimeters, we give them a bigger blade size, and we put them in the back of a K4, that might not be a suitable overload because that's probably challenging this person too much. So be really mindful of how you overload a young athlete. And then if you do it correctly, you get an increase in muscle mass and strength, you get an increase in neuromuscular control and an increase in performance. So the other one I was talking about just before is the pathophysiological overload, and that's damaging. So if we're damaging overload with potentially changing too many things at once, we see increased fatigue, increased risk of injury, and potential overtraining and burnout. So few adaptations to resistance training. We see an increase in muscle fibers in size, hypertrophy in response to resistance training. Hypertrophy is mainly due to the increased synthesis of contractile proteins within the muscles. Hypertrophy is mediated by an increase in anabolic hormones following resistance exercise, and that's why we see more increase in muscle mass in males. To gain muscle size gains, train for longer than 6 weeks. So quick results is not, that definitely won't be happening in training. So longer than 6 weeks to get a training effect. Hypertrophy in response to resistance exercises results in increased muscle mass. And we see also an increased muscle hyperplasia, fiber hyperplasia, which is an increase of numbers of the muscle fibers, and that also can lead to increased muscle size. So if we take all that into account, what we've just gone through, and if we look at sexual and skeletal development, muscular growth and neuromuscular control, joint stability and adaptation, with some of the pathway athletes, we look at records from musculoskeletal screenings and injury records. We often see the following developments. And I can give you some examples because today we actually did some musculoskeletal screening of the junior sprint team that's going overseas. And there were some really interesting developments which I will share with you. In teenage males, we see a fast growth spurt due to the increase in testosterone. Skeleton grows first, the muscles grow second, and neuromuscular control grows last. We often see tight hamstrings, a hypomobile thoracic spine and slump posture. We can see tight hip flexors with increased stress on the lumbar spine. And we often see tightness and poor glide of the sciatic nerve. So that's those athletes that get pins and needles in their feet when they're paddling and they complain about it. Now, today we actually screened all the the under 18s who are on the Australian team. And these are obviously slightly more advanced paddlers who have been picked up by the state institutes and have had some screening there, some musculoskeletal screening. And they usually have started a gym program. And it was really lovely to see that the care these athletes receive these days really was paying off, because we only saw, I think out of 7, we only saw 2 athletes with tight hamstrings. Most of them still had a little bit of a hypomobile thoracic spine. There were no tight hip flexors, which means they're all stretching well, and none of them had a poor glide of the sciatic nerve, which was really very encouraging to see. And that means that the messaging we send across as physios working within the national network is being taken on board, and athletes are getting some screening done before they develop injuries. Also with tight pectoralis major and minor, we didn't see a lot of that today. Poorly coordinated, yes, we still saw that, where athletes struggle to do a one-leg squat. And in some individuals, we did see some poor activation of stabilizing muscles, which is also normal. Interesting was that this was an athlete who hadn't done a lot of gym work yet. So as soon as they're starting to develop some gym work and they get some input from strength and conditioning coaches, these potential issues that we see in teenagers don't occur, which is really, very positive to see. So just to take note, neuromuscular control in long-limbed tall athletes can take longer to develop than in short, often more stockier individuals. And I think you've all seen those examples of tall, gangly athletes who really take longer to learn a skill or to develop and feel comfortable within their body. Like one of the girls I coached for about 9 years, she's 6 foot. She was tall and gangly. She used to break every cup in the kitchen at the Institute of Sport, and it took her a long time to grow into her body and to even develop proper movements on water. Once she got there, though, she never looked back, and she's still one of the leading athletes now. Male athletes can be prone to injury due to that less muscle flexibility, leading to poor postures under load. They can lack neuromuscular control, which can easily lead to overload, in particular of the spine, but also other joints like shoulder and elbow. And I think I have some pictures here. So these are pictures of the study I did some years ago. And if you look at the athlete on the right top-hand side, you can see that increase in thoracic kyphosis, which means the athlete looks like they bend forward a little bit. And this young lad particularly had very tight hamstrings, so he couldn't actually sit up properly. If you look at the picture on the left bottom, this is on the left stroke, the 2 athletes in a K2. Left stroke, their body position is in the boat. They were doing this pretty well, quite together. Whereas on the right, you could see the athlete in the back really couldn't hold his posture and was leaning away from the stroke. When I scanned the athlete on the right with live ultrasound, he really wasn't able to hold his right abdominals together at all under load. So they really needed a lot of feedback before they got that right. I hope everyone can see that difference there between left and right. So let's go to female athletes. So in female athletes, we don't see as much muscular development due to the lack of anabolic steroids. This and the effect of estradiol on the passive joints restraints can lead to poor joint stability, so they're easier to overload, poor muscle strength in relation to physical requirements in stabilizing as well as in force producing muscles. We see a widening of the hips and the pelvis and an increase in that adipose tissue. And that causes a lot of stress in young girls. I'm training so hard, why am I not skinnier? And it's really, really important to reinforce with the girls that you coach that this is normal in teenage female athletes. The body is preparing for childbirth and is increasing adipose tissue. Now, we probably see a peak of that when the girls are about 18, 19 years of age. And we find that it generally changes if they keep training to a more lean body composition in the early to mid 20s. I think the messaging around that there is very important. And these days, what we do here at the AIS is we reinforce a body for function and a body for performance. And we stay away from any thing saying, oh, you're too fat, you're not skinny enough, you're developing too much body mass. We really stay away from that because I think that's a very unhealthy habit to get into. So it's really important to reinforce a body for performance and function. And as I mentioned, usually in the early 20s, these ladies change and become a lot leaner and change their body composition. Common issues with the girls are shoulder injuries, low back pain, and winging scapular shoulder blades. Often they weight transfer away from the stroke. They seem to have more issues than the boys with leaning in team boats. They tend to have poor pelvic and hip stability and not always activating the core muscles properly. If you have a look at the junior in this picture here, you can clearly see in her right propulsion phase that she's leaning away to the left-hand side. And she's tipping the boat away instead of leaning on the stroke and pulling the boat past it. And that's just lack of core stability and control. Now, when I scanned this girl, she could actually control it pretty well in a very controlled environment. But as soon as you put her on an unstable base, she was not able to control her body position. So, if we put this all together, important to make one change at a time. So don't start bench pull and increase blade size or paddle size at one time. Small changes so bodies can adapt and adjust. In the gym, so stretching for those athletes with muscular tightness, train stability and movement control prior to loading. Start loading gradually and work on muscle endurance. So more reps create patterning before you really start working on strength. I think since I wrote this presentation and now, which is probably a few years ago, things have changed a lot with strength and conditioning, and we are a lot more aware of teaching movement prior to loading. So that's really, really important. So on the water, it would be really nice if we all had stable boats to start off in. I know that's not always the case. We're in Pathways is at the moment looking at trying to find some more stable boats. So it's a little bit easier for young athletes to learn technique in a stable boat. Also important is to use a paddle that's suitable for age, training age and strength. So a 15-year-old boy is not going to use the same paddle as a 15-year-old girl, likely. Resistance training, how much resistance is suitable? And this is mainly on-water resistance training, which we do in sprint. And how do you judge that? As you put resistance on, it's really important for the athlete to maintain the correct technique. As soon as they change technique, you should reduce the resistance. They should be able to hold their correct technique at all times. Another question is the athlete ready for team boat training, and how much? How intense is team boat training? And can we use team boats early to improve control and strength? In Australia, we usually start paddling K1s. If we look at Europe, a lot of the European countries actually throw all their 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds in K4s. Different philosophy. I think they just have to make it work. And I think they also have more K4s available than we have in most of the clubs, for example, and more kits on the water. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other. You can start them in K1s, you can start them in K4s. It can all work, but it's interesting to see how different countries do it. Important to work on correct technique and patterning before increasing load. Try to maintain correct movement patterns while increasing session time, increase speed or stroke rates or higher intensity. So remember those stages of motor learning. So any teenage athlete will benefit from thorough musculoskeletal screening by a physiotherapist familiar with kayaking. And I think this has been happening quite a lot over the last 6, 7, 8 years. And it's really nice to see these athletes developing with less injury. They're coming into camps with less injury, and they are better adapted to the gym and to paddling, which is really lovely to see. When an athlete comes back with musculoskeletal screening and recommendations, make sure that as a coach you follow through with recommendations. Ultimately, it's the athlete's responsibility, but as we know with teenagers, we sometimes need to remind them of what to do. I realized that was a whole lot of information all at once. Any questions, please let me know.
So Anna, can you stop sharing, and then we can see everyone and people can wave when they're ready to ask a question? And while we're waiting for Anna to do that, perfect, thank you. Right, any questions? Thank you very much, Anna.
Yeah, a lot of information, sorry guys, in that.
Emily, you have a question? No?
I do.
Okay.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for the presentation. It was awesome. With overtraining, I know that some sporting organisations weigh their athletes every week to make sure that they're not growing, and when they go through a growing phase, they actually take them off a lot of the high impact activities. Do you have any recommendations for that? Is it a good thing? Is it weighing children counterproductive? What's your view on that?
I don't like weighing athletes. I think that can have a negative impact, especially in female athletes. Male athletes probably a little bit different. You know, if you weigh them when they're 16 and then you weigh them 2 months later and they gain weight, that probably contributed to muscle gains. But a girl might not. So I think weighing athletes is not something we do anymore. And that's when we talk about body for performance and not looking at what someone weighs, because as far as I'm concerned, it's completely irrelevant. You know, you can have an 85. We've had girls that weigh 80 kilos and they make national team and Olympic teams. And it doesn't really matter what someone weighs. It's about all their power to weight ratio and how you can apply that power onto the boat. Like, for example, if you look at the New Zealand team over the last few years, the New Zealand K2 is Lisa Carrington and Caitlin Ryan. Like Lisa weighs, I think she would be, I guess, about early 60s in kilos, whereas Caitlin is probably around 80 kilos. But, power to weight, they would be very similar. So why would you weigh someone who weighs 80 kilos if their power to weight's the same and their speed is very similar? It's
Sorry.
not about
I
what
should
you
have.
weigh. It's about what you can do with it.
I should have specified to understand how they're growing. So if they're going through a growth phase, how would we usually see that, and should we reduce the amount of training they're doing?
I think if they're growing, I think it is important to be mindful. How you monitor it exactly is probably not so much, that's probably not so much in my knowledge base. That's probably more sports physiology. But I guess there must be charts out there that say if they grow more than like 2 or 3 or 4 centimeters per month or 2 months, that you have to be more careful with loading them. I'm not exactly aware of numbers. I certainly wouldn't weigh them. I would probably more look at the length of their limbs, their seated height, and their general growth, as in length, not looking at weight, because we know if they grow really quickly that their neuromuscular control is not as good as someone who grows slower. And when their neuromuscular control lags a little bit behind, that's when they're more prone on injury.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. DJ, you next.
Anna, thank you for the presentation. I've got about 1,000 questions. I guess the one that's most relevant to me is the number of sessions per week. How do you split that or recommend that in relation to on-water versus off-water training and total number of sessions? For example, American Gridiron coaches now are only training their kids 8 times a week, and that includes outside of their activities. So if the kid goes roller skating on the weekend, they count that as an activity and make sure they don't overtrain.
Yeah, I think in the new pathway structures that we are developing, we are also counting those activities and like the school's activities, what sports they play at school and how many sessions they do. And I cannot remember the new recommendation that's in there, but it depends a little bit on the kids' training age. So if they've trained for 3 or 4 years, they can probably handle more sessions than when they just started training about 3 months ago. So it's a little bit individual. I think kids up to about 15, 16 years, they can do 1 or 2 sessions a day, but for them, it's mainly about fun and engaging and not forgetting the social component of training and not being mindful not to overload them. But I would have to go back through the new pathways document and have a look what our physiologist has written exactly on how many sessions per week. But we should have those documents up on the Paddle Australia website hopefully in September.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you,
And how much on water versus off water? Sorry, it was a two-parter, I know. That was the first part.
Is that for sprint, slalom, polo?
Generically, well, polo obviously is the only canoe sport, right? So no, but what? Yeah, in general for kids.
In general, for kids, I would like to see them on water 4 times a week and in the gym 2 to 3 times a week.
Thank you.
Okay, Cherie, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the stretching. Should we incorporate that in our sessions, all our sessions, especially the on the water sessions? We do a lot of on water sessions. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the idea of incorporating that as part of your warm up. And what we do here, we get the athletes to come 20 minutes early. Say we're on water at 7:30, so they'll be there at 7:10. And especially for juniors, you need to obviously supervise them to a degree with just stretching and do some general stretching and activation exercises before you go on water. First of all, their neural system wakes up a little bit more, their bodies are warmed up, and their risk of injury is reduced. So I think it's a very good idea to stretch beforehand. Yes, stretch and activate beforehand.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
I've got my hand up.
Okay, Scott.
Thank you. Hi, Anna. Good to see you. Almost to a person, I could say that all of my kids who are hypermobile are the kids who struggle to perform. You know, when they just can't generate the force, and they actually even struggle no matter how much focus I put on them to generate more strength. They just struggle to do it. So have you got anything specific that you would recommend for us to look at to help them?
Yeah, it's interesting, Scott, you mentioned that. We had that discussion today at work when we screened our junior team, because we noticed that all the girls in the current junior team are hypermobile. And I don't know them as well as Kate does, the physio, and she said we've had injury risks with every one of them. And yeah, obviously you stick them in a K4 where a lot of force transfer is required, and there is an increased risk of injury. So we had a discussion about that today, and it's about reinforcing good behaviours, as in stabilising exercises before they go on water. So in that case, you don't stretch as much before you go on, but you do more activation, especially around those joints that are important for stability in paddling, like a little bit of core stability, a little bit of glute activation, and obviously some activation around the shoulders. And just doing that consistently over and over and over again will eventually pay off.
Sure.
Like if you look at athletes in the past, for example, Lindsay Fogarty, she was quite hypermobile. You know, it obviously paid off for her because she got an Olympic bronze medal. So it does work, and it is a matter of persisting and doing it before every session consistently. And we call it part of our prehab. Instead of rehabilitation, we call it prehabilitation. So yes, Scott, good luck. You might need to keep nagging. But I think life of a coach. But I think those athletes are challenging, yes.
Yep.
Because
Thanks,
they have
mate.
that hypermobility.
Cool.
Anna, I have a question quickly related to that, and that is that where can a club coach lay their hands on reliable information on the kinds of stabilizing exercises? Activation exercises tend to be quite consistent in advice on the internet. Stretching, of course, is well described on the internet, but what about the stabilizing, prehab stabilizing exercises?
Yeah, there are some good exercises available online, I'm sure, especially for shoulder stability, where you go, I can't get up now, but internal rotation, external rotation, like especially external rotation is obviously very important for shoulder stability. If you bear with me, in about a couple of months, we should have the Education Pathways Hub up online, which will provide access to coaches registered with Paddle Australia to all those resources. So it will have a lot of information on strength and conditioning, on physio, on screening, on stability exercises, on any aspect of the para pathway, of the pathways for able-bodied as well as for para athletes.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
So
okay,
coming,
TJ.
Anyone
else?
like mad?
Yeah, I'll keep asking questions if no one else wants to jump in there, but I'll keep jumping to the back of the line. And I, particularly in polo, and I've seen some of it in some of the K1 races I've watched, we have like a sea of shruggers. They don't have suitable scapular stability, and they're started with paddles that were too big or boats that were too slow, and they shrug quite a bit. And for us in polo, we have just lots of people with shoulder injuries because they compound that with throwing. Any thoughts on getting younger ones to either, increase that shoulder scapular stability to stop that shrugging?
Yes. Yeah. Look, I think again, pre-activation there is quite important. And sorry, I can't move, but you can start really basic with, standing with your back against the wall and getting your
Hmm.
athletes to push back against the wall, shoulder blades back. You
Yep.
know, you can also do that when they lay on their stomach on on a flat surface and bring chest and shoulders up with their hands up. So they
Yep.
keep pulling their shoulder blades together. That's a lovely pre-activation exercise as well.
So
If you
looking
have
at
the band,
neural control.
yes,
Yep.
yes, before you go on water.
Hmm.
Or for example, with elastic bands, you can tie the bands in front of you and pull
Hmm.
two arms back with straight arms and bring your shoulder
Yep.
blades together there.
Yeah,
Another exercise.
we super push bands before paddling, and I don't
Mhm.
encourage or let my athletes do stretching before paddling. And I know that sounds wrong, but lots of activation, lots of getting into the positions, but not excessively trying to put the joints into extended positions, because I find that kind of
No, you
leaves
don't need to.
them loose
Yes,
and
yes, you
uncomfortable.
don't need to. Activation before the session is more important than stretching.
Yeah.
Stretching, like if, for example, if someone has tight hamstrings, they're better off doing that at night,
Yes.
in their own
Or
time.
after the
Before,
session. Yeah. Yeah.
after the session, yes. Before the session, activation is more important than stretching and warm up, like a little bit of a
Hmm.
jog or sit on exercise bike. Active,
Yes,
it's
ma'am.
all about activation and not as much stretching. Occasionally, like we do stretch rotation before a session because it's part of paddling K1, but
Hmm.
we don't necessarily stretch hamstrings unless someone's really tight.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Ellie, you're next.
Okay, I hope you haven't answered this, Anna. I've had a few dropouts. Just wondering at what minimum age, I know it varies depending on the individual development, but what would be the minimum age you would put kids in the gym? I take on board what you've been saying about injury prevention from gym but actual weights, what would you be
Yeah,
suggesting?
look, a little bit different depending on the individual development, but I think up to age 14, roughly, I think kids can be in the gym but do only body weight exercises.
Right.
They do not touch weight. They learn how to move, like they learn how to do a squat. They learn how to do a chin up. They learn how to do abdominal exercises. But it's all about, or learn how to do a push up. But it's all about learning movement without weights and without resistance, because the human body can provide quite a lot of resistance anyway. If you do a push up, you provide resistance with your body weight. The same if you do a chin up. So I have no objections to young athletes doing chin-ups or squats or push-ups, but body weight only. Like for example, young athletes, it's really nice to get them to hold a stick and then do a squat with an extended, elevated shoulder position, so they keep their back nice and straight. And it's all about learning. Then I think when they about late 14, early 15, you can start them with some more weight exercises. That's probably my preference.
Great,
Does that
thanks.
make sense?
Have you had anything to do with Pilates for paddlers, or is it
Yeah.
more?
We do use it, especially probably a little bit more for the girls because they do seem to have more issues with core stability sometimes than the boys. And yeah, we use it at the moment. We use it with the para athletes as well because they tend to have differences left and right. But yeah, we have used it with our national team members. definitely. And it's
Great,
all about
thank you.
gaining body control. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Any other questions other than DJ at the moment? No?
I'm happy to leave. I'm happy to leave my questions. That for some reason the hand raise hasn't gone down from when I asked my second question. It's still up. I can't.
If there are no questions, I had a question, Anna. One of the
Mm-hmm.
in Canberra, we're lucky because we have access to a myriad of sports specialists because of the historic location of the AIS and still quite a few AIS programs in Canberra. But even so, I find in our club, it's very hard for us to get a physiotherapist or a sports masseuse who understands kayaking in its true form. Do you know how we can educate, select, find people? You said, you know, it's really important to get in touch with a physiotherapist who understands kayaking. What's the process of getting somebody who understands kayaking? How can we move people towards understanding our sport better?
Yeah, look, that is always a difficult question. And I guess in some programs are lucky because we have quite a few physios who have been athletes and have come through the system and are now educating. Like one of the athletes who's a physio as well went to Victoria this recent weekend and did a lot of athlete and coach education in the Bendigo short course marathon races. Yes, it is very difficult, and unless you know someone, I guess, who's come through the system and is a physio or is interested in learning, yeah, it's hard to find. Even the physios we've had here at the National Centre for Excellence, you know, it takes a long time before they truly understand paddling, and they have to come out on the motorboat quite a few times. We like to put them in a boat as well, so they actually know how difficult it is, because the athletes make it look quite easy, but it's not that easy. So they don't really understand until you put them in a K1 and actually go, okay, try to paddle the thing, and they go, oh, all of a sudden you see a light bulb moment, and they go, oh my God, is this what it's like? Okay, now I understand better. Yeah, so I think that's a whole process. So you need to find someone who's interested, and yeah, even if they have a little bit of background into the sport, it's a challenge.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yep, Scott. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with you, Margie. It's tough to find a physio who is fully committed and interested and understands what you need to talk about in your local area. And I'm going to put Matt on the spot. Sorry, Matt. So Matt Cranny's here. So he's our physio for Evoca. So he works on with our squad and our pathways squad. Anna probably knows Matt, I would imagine. Matt's done a bit of work up on the Gold Coast. So Matt, I think it might be good perspective. Like, how is it that we can find people like you?
Thanks, Scotty.
Sorry, Matt. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, I think it's just, yeah, I think it's tricky. I think you got to reach out to these people is probably the key for it. You probably need to look for your sports titled therapist. Would you agree, Anna, to have people who are interested in sport and have an interest in biomechanics and things like that? We've probably had a more specific training pathway in that versus like your general physio or your musculoskeletal physiotherapist. Yeah. So a physio that has a sports titling written after their name is probably a simple rule of thumb. Yeah. And there are a few, there's the Find a Physio website, which will have elements of that written there. And I can put a link in here in the chat box if you like. It shows you an area, and then you can select a sports titled and interest off the back of that. That's probably one way to start it. Yeah. But otherwise, I think developing a network, which I think, like Anna sort of mentioned this before, for physios in certain areas for people to reach out to.
Thanks, Matt. That's actually great. If you could put that URL up, that'd be wonderful. The reason why I raised it is because many of the people in this forum will be working with people who get injured, and it's having access to somebody locally who can then put them on the right path to recovery. In our club, I've seen so many situations where people have received not incorrect, but perhaps not as sport specific rehab as they could have had, especially with shoulders, actually. So yeah, Matt, we'd be very interested in that URL, and we need to start developing somebody in our part of the world at least, and I'm sure others would feel the same way. Thanks. Yep. Any other questions? Come on, guys. Oh no.
You can also distribute my email address, Margie, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that come up later.
Okay, I will put your email address up. Okay.
Keeping in mind
Well,
that I'm out of the country soon and I'll be on a flight, so if they have to wait for the answer, it'll be because I'm flying.
not a problem. I'm just busy getting your email address now, and I will be back to the GoToMeeting. Here it is, everybody. It's going up on the message now. And I think there's a couple of things in final. Matt, what is your message? Adding my location or I'm in Canberra. Yeah. Okay. There are a couple of things in today's talk that I found absolutely fascinating in light of my coaching coordinator position, and in yes, okay. In terms of what's coming up with the Paddle New South Wales education program. Most of you, I hope, know about the conference that's been held on the 16th and 17th of July in soggy Penrith. At the moment, the conference is going ahead. We have no reason to cancel it. People are sogged out, but it's not too bad in Penrith. And we will be letting all of you who've signed up know about it. But one of the really interesting things about the conference is that we will be talking about how to teach adolescents who are going through all of these physical growth and adaptation processes that Anna's been talking about. And the neurological learning is, of course, a key one. And the kinds of things that we can teach in terms of, here's an idea, develop an extension, versus you will do it this way because that's the way it is, because that's all that their neurological system can take at that particular age. So it's really nice to see how the different sciences and arts of producing talented and happy and injury-free paddlers come together. So unless we have any more questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a very big thank you to Anna for taking time out of your busy schedule. We wish you and the para athletes and our junior athletes all the luck in the world, and we hope you stay COVID-free in the realms of Europe, and you show them the back ends of your kayaks. I hope you all join me and say au revoir, and we will see you at the next Paddle New South Wales Education webinar/conference. Thanks everybody for joining. Cheerio.